Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today is my good friend Rndmgy. We have done podcasts in the past with Rndmgy about linguistic magic and sovereign citizency and the law and how the law works, as well as about medicines like steroids and testosterone and what they can do for people. But today we're going to talk about a different subject, which is the cosmology of the earth and what is the nature of the earth, and is it as it's been described, or have we been misled, and if so, why? So make sure you join the Temple Mount Discord server so that you can join these podcasts live and find our past episodes on YouTube and BitChute, Temple Mount Official Roundtable Podcast. You can find them there. That being said, welcome, Rndmgy. How are you, my friend?
Thank you, brother. I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm feeling great. I'm happy. Awesome. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I overheard a little bit of a discussion, and I thought it's been too long since we revisited the topic. So, what were you going to say something?
Oh, I was saying, well, yeah, that's it can't be talked about enough, in my opinion. Exactly. It's one of those that I think that the message needs to get out there. And
it ties so many things together.
It really does. And especially if you believe in God, you read the Bible and such, you a spiritual man or woman, there's an awful lot that goes along with this, that specifically the difference between the heliocentric versus the geocentric is creation versus an explosion that creates a perfect dynamic of in sync swirling chunks of rock.
So why don't we start with, like, where did your interest in the subject begin? What was the first thing that kind of got you questioning or even interested in this subject? Can you remember when?
Yeah, it was a great question. In fact, I don't remember exactly when, but it was several years ago, probably close to 8 years ago now, maybe at the least 7, at the least, but I'm thinking closer to 8. There was a family friend that was speaking with the wife one night, and I wasn't really fond of this family friend. He was okay, and I'd known him since he was a young boy. He just had some attitude, so just not super fond of the attitude. And he said something to her about Earth being flat. And she mentioned that to me, and my first response was, bullshit. And even though I'd had questions as a young boy, at that point, I had pretty much bitten into and believed everything NASA and GovCo and all kinds of things. And then it was about 2 weeks after that, I was reading an article about how theoretical physicists didn't believe that we were in a universe, but more of multiverses, and they were flat, and everything in them were flat, and they're stacked like a deck of cards. And when I read that, I thought, oh, shit, are you serious? Now this is going to make me go out and have to prove one way or the other that we're either on a ball or we're not. One way or the other. And I actually set out pretty much at that point to prove this family friend wrong. I was bound and determined I was going to figure out a way to shut this guy down. And ultimately, at the end of my studies and personal investigation, and I mean actually getting out with lasers, telescopes, binoculars, going up into high-rise buildings, going up onto hills, doing as many different things as I could possibly figure out to either observe and or duplicate certain things that we see around us and to see what actually is. And one of the little experiments, just as a simple one, it was light streaks, hot spots, like when you see the moon or the sun hot streaking across the water, especially the moon, because then you can look directly at it and not get blinded. But that water has a nice light streak coming across it, and it comes right to you. It's the same as when you're holding up a glass jar or a glass that you might put water in, any kind of glass, lights will streak across the flat part, but it will not wrap around the curved part. No matter how much you twist it and turn it, it always will streak on the flat, but it will never streak on the curve. That's just one of many. So, yeah. And essentially, I started off with doing as many visual things and then got into more abstract stuff that was a little bit harder for people to visualize, but yet still highly accurate, such as gyroscopes and a few other things. So, in fact, one of the things that I came up with, and that is first, when it comes to this thing of whether or not we're on a ball or on a flat, it's not totally flat. In my estimation, my humble opinion is that it undulates. There's hills and there's valleys and there's trees and there's bushes and all kinds of, well, now, especially with mankind, there's buildings and structures and such. So it undulates. It's not perfectly flat. It has undulation. But the basic premise is, though, it's not really a ball. And if it is indeed a ball, it's so much bigger than what we have been told. And that being said, then their math, they being so-called Geological Survey and NASA and all of them, doesn't fit. It just simply doesn't fit. So, but in fact, one of the things, especially with the ball, you have to have essentially corresponding continuity and consistency. In other words, that curvature must be pretty much identically the same on all parts of the ball. It must correlate and correspond with pure continuity and consistency throughout, which basically means that no matter where you're standing on this so-called ball, if it were indeed on a ball, it would seem that everything is falling down away from you. And the further out you look, it would seem that it falls down, not up. And by up, when we look at, say, like the ocean, or we're out on a flat plain where we can see for so-called miles, that horizon always rises to eye level. The only reason that it would do this is if we were looking at what is known as the vanishing point. In other words, the parallel convergence. When you have two lines that parallel each other as they run off into the distance, they begin to look like they're converging. They come together in what is known as the vanishing point. You can't have that if one of those lines starts to curve away from the other. If there's even a little bit of a tick to the outside as opposed to inward, those lines, as they get further apart, will seem and appear to be further apart, or they'll actually start to look like they're actually parallel and never come together. And this is just one of those things that is a fact of so-called science. And just as a quick, science, I know, is considered to be something where you have your theory, you do your thesis, and you go out and you see if you can produce evidence of the thesis. But that's not what science used to be. In the very beginning, science simply was observing, measuring, and repeating something to see if you get the consistent evidence. And of course, in nature, we just look for observable, repeatable, measurable events or evidence. If we see something happen and then we see it happen again and then we see it happen again, we record these things and we take all the data that we possibly can. And then we come to these conclusions after a bit of, well, this happened because, well, this, and this started to take place beforehand and then this occurred. That's just kind of how things are. So we go back to then again, nothing can be and not be at the same time, because it's either going to be this or it's not. It's just that simple. So,
So let's
yeah.
take a moment. You've covered a lot, and it's great. So the first thing we're saying is the planet Earth has been misdescribed to us, right? What we've
Very
been
much
taught
so.
is a misdescription, as well as probably what space is has also been misdescribed to us.
Yes.
And like you said, if the Earth is a sphere, it's provably not a sphere with the dimensions that they tell us it is, because by telling us the dimensions that they say that it is, we can calculate how many inches per mile of curvature should be observed, and then using long distance photography and horizontal level ground photography, we can see way farther than that.
Yes.
We can't see through the curve. That doesn't make any sense. And the argument that it's refraction doesn't make any sense, because refraction inverts the image and creates like a mirage like effect. But what we had is
Exactly.
long distance photography all the way to the base of buildings that are way farther away than they should be. So then we're either on a flat Earth or a sphere of massive size, which brings up the question of, well, why does it matter? People will ask. And one of the reasons it matters is because if there is extra land masses, extra continents, islands, oceans that are being exploited, and we're not even being told that they exist, right?
Yep.
That's one possibility. And you've probably heard about, the inner Earth and Admiral Byrd and all that kind of stuff as well. But let's talk a little about flight paths, because you were mentioning earlier, I think, going to Japan or Australia or something, and
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
realizing that some of these flight paths make absolutely no sense on a sphere Earth, but make perfect sense on a flat Earth.
Absolutely. And when you look at there's two different um, maps that you can look at. One would be the azimuthal equidistant map that's easy to find, but then there's also Gleason's map, the time and distance scientifically accurate map from what is it, like 1890 something. And yeah, you can look at all your different so-called countries. If you look at what the flight paths that especially the airliners, because these are the most known, the paths that they take make absolute sense when you look at them on a flat Earth map, but when you look at them on a globe, it makes absolutely no sense. And in fact, one of the ones that's the most interesting is when I did get into this and I started looking at this specific portion of the whole thing. I remember back when I was in fourth or fifth grade, and one of the teachers back then said something to the class about how her husband was a so-called airline pilot, and she drew a little sketch of the globe, and she do a diagram of how he explained to her the flight paths were and how they would go up and around as opposed to straight line. Well, anybody anywhere can take a string and just on a ball, hold the string in one spot and go to any spot on that ball, and you'll find that that string goes the quickest straight line. If you go up and over the top of that ball, it adds a whole lot more time and distance to the travel point. It makes zero sense. But then, of course, if you look at that same thing on the flat Earth, if you're to take that ball and flatten it out, all of a sudden it makes perfect sense because it becomes a straight line and it's not up and over. And the other line that would be a straight line, you'd have to do this really long distance, and it would actually be way more.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm a Christian, right? I don't know how you identify, but I do believe the Bible contains a lot of transcendent truths. And the Bible is very clear, excessively, repetitively clear, that the earth is fixed, firm, and immovable.
Yep.
Cannot be moved, will not be moved, is set on pillars, of foundation.
Yep.
Has a firmament dome over it that is quote unquote strong like molten glass, which separates quote unquote the waters above from the waters below.
Yep.
And on and on. I mean, it talks about a tree in the book of Daniel that can be seen from every part of the earth, right? Which is only possible on a flat earth. It talks about when Jesus returning, he'll be seen by everyone at once, which is only possible on a flat earth. And so it's just worth noting that the biblical model is a flat Earth model. You'll find Christian apologetics, including Mr. Batman, who will try to say no, Christianity is not flat Earth, but it is actually. It describes the world as a circle of the Earth. That's why the Ancient of Days painting shows God reaching down with a square and compass and describing a compass with a geometrical tool. Right? He's drawing a disc like a pizza pan.
Right.
And there are words in the Bible that mean sphere, and the word that they use when referring to the earth is not the word that means sphere, it's the word that means disc. And they had a different word that meant sphere. So when people say, oh, they meant sphere when they said disc, no, they would have said sphere if they meant sphere. They said disc. Right. And they said that the earth is God's footstool. And so what you end up with is a model something like a snow globe, right? Like a flat snow globe with a dome, and then everything inside of that.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, speaking of the dome, and overall, it's come to my attention too that even in this, I've talked about before, especially when it comes to government and all, how there's full disclosure. Well, there's full disclosure on this shit too. In fact, one of the biggest full disclosures is on the grave marker of Werner von Braun, who is the head Nazi rocket engineer. He became the head NASA rocket engineer. And on his grave marker, it has the Bible passage, Psalms 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. This is on the top rocket engineer of NASA's grave marker. He's telling you right now, as his last words, there is no globe. We're under a dome.
Right. And I don't know if you saw Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yes.
If you're familiar with him, but he said, he's like, there's one thing I want your generation to get through its head. The earth is a closed system, right? And this is supposed to be like, and he says, I want you to understand one thing. The earth is a closed system. And then you look at Elon Musk, for example, 2023, multi-billionaire, all the science and technology that we've had since Apollo 1 or whatever, right? All the progress they should have made with NASA. And he can't even get a rocket out of space. It blows up. It hits the firmament. He can't even put a rocket on the moon or on Mars.
Yep.
Right. And the reason why is because that firmament is there. And there's some actual disclosure because scientists have come out recently saying that space, like we were always told space is a vacuum, right? It's an empty vacuum that sucks everything, right? That's not true. What they're telling us now is space is a quote unquote slippery superfluid. So it's like a liquid. It's like a super slippery liquid, which again makes sense from the biblical point of view when it says separating the waters above from the waters below. So what are they saying now? It's a superfluid. And now this is where we're going to get into some other stuff. But Gary McKinnon was an autistic super genius hacker, and he successfully penetrated the Department of Defense military computers. And he uncovered something called Project Solar Warden. And what that was a secret space program that the United States government was running. And they had what were called like Heideggers. And they were essentially like nuclear submarines that were operating in outer space. So this is tangential, conjectural. But my understanding is you can actually have spaceships in outer space, but they're not rockets. You can't use rockets like to shoot up into space with hydrocarbons. You need essentially like nuclear submarines to travel through the fluid that is on the other side of the firmament, as well as a way to get through it or out of it. That's, conjecture, right? But
right. Well, and this is the thing with these books and the, in fact, right before we started the podcast, I dropped the link to the Library of Congress, or the one article that it talks about where in Japan many years ago, there was a map published that showed land beyond the ice walls. In fact, it was Hawaiian Gazette from 1907. It showed a map that was in what I believe was a Japanese newspaper that showed the lands beyond the ice wall. And that's what we were talking about earlier. Those two books were like Mars and Jupiter, and those are lands beyond, potentially, quite possibly, on the other side of the ice wall. That's the kind of the key thing, because it's very possible that that's exactly what Admiral Byrd was talking about in the Longines interview after he came back from the so-called South Pole, when he talked about land, unexplored land, as far away from the South Pole as Middle America, is how he put it.
Exactly right. So for anybody who doesn't know, Admiral Byrd is a fascinating character. He was a war hero, or a war, important figure in the war in World War II, but he was also an explorer, and he explored the Antarctic region, and he gave some fantastic accounts of going into the inner Earth. And it's even weirder with him. Like, it never ends with Admiral Byrd. Like, after World War II, they sent him an Operation High Jump up to Antarctica because the Nazis had like a classified spatial research base in Antarctica. So they sent Admiral Byrd with a whole battle group of aircraft carriers to try and take out the remains of the Nazi secret weapon they call Wunderwaffen division, wonder weapons. Right. That they were trying to develop. And apparently these things called Hanabus, and the Hanabus are essentially Nazi UFOs. They had the Iron Cross on them, and they looked like primitive flying saucers. But they came out of the ocean and wreaked havoc on Admiral Byrd's fleet, and they had to retreat, basically. Now, you say this, and it sounds completely crazy, right? It doesn't sound like a true story. But if you do the research on this, this is what happened. Like, they sent a cleanup crew to get the Nazis and their experimental propulsion technology out of Antarctica, and some diehard members of the technocratic elite of the Nazi Third Reich fought back, and because they had such advanced craft, they actually did a lot of damage. But it's beyond dispute that they sent a full battle group to Antarctica. So obviously it wasn't just some scientific research mission. They knew they were going there for a fight.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And then Admiral Byrd, you can still find this black and white interview. He comes back, first person ever to go to Antarctica on a plane, whatever. And he says there is more resources and more land in Antarctica than all the world's resources put together. And there's going to be a massive rush of all the countries towards these resources, right? That's what he says. And then all of a sudden you get the Antarctic Treaty, which says all the countries in the world say nobody goes to Antarctica, nobody exploits it, nobody develops it, nobody can travel there. Yeah. But Admiral Byrd came on and said there's more resources there than the whole world uses, So we're being kept in the middle of a petri dish. Then there's an ice wall, and then there's a bigger petri dish with a whole bunch of more continents, land masses.
Right.
And we're just in the equivalent of a fishbowl.
Yeah, and of course the interesting part of that whole Antarctic Treaty is that every so-called nation in the world has signed it, and it's about the only treaty that has never been broken in one shape or another. There's a couple of others, but there's never been a treaty where everybody in the world has signed it and nobody has broken it.
Yeah, they all agree. It's so important that every nation on Earth, they can't agree on climate change, they can't agree on war and peace, they can't agree on food and starvation, they can't agree on anything, but they all agree that nobody goes to Antarctica. I wonder why that is. Yeah.
Yeah, imagine that. Gee, could it be that there's something down there, or out there, I should say, that they don't want us to know?
And who's been to Antarctica in the past few years? The Pope, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Democratic presidential nominee Bill Clinton. There's been a who's who of important people who have gone. Prince Charles from Buckingham Palace. They've all flown out to Antarctica to be shown something that we're not allowed to know. Yeah. Is it the frozen remnants of Atlantis? Is it giant bodies, frozen? Is it aliens, a UFO frozen in ice, a gateway to the inner Earth? I mean, it's something.
I figure that they probably are actually doing the little recreation of Admiral Byrd's flight. They're taking them up in a plane, taking them over the ice wall, and showing them where there's some land on the other side.
Right. And if you read Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, it's about when all the rich people in the world give up on the rest of humanity and decide that they're going to make their own utopian paradise for like super rich people. And that's the idea of Atlas Shrugged. Well, what if that's the case with the elites of our world, right? This is like a slave colony. It's like a farm where we all work and toil and pay taxes. But those of them who have ascended all the way back in World War II, right, they had flying machines and free electricity and Tesla technology, and they created a breakaway civilization, and they went over the ice wall. And then we're in this like pen. It's like an enclosure, right? And they're potentially setting up Wakanda-esque, utopias on the other side of the ice wall.
Right. Well, let me cover a couple of things here. First, let's go back to one of the things that we were talking about as far as the math. The math, just to give everybody an idea that how they can figure this out. The basic math is you want to take your mileage, square it, and times it by either 0.67, or if you want the full version, it's 0.6666667. It's actually 7 sixes and a 7. And how we come to that number is you divide 8 by 12, and that gives you the 7 sixes and a 7. If you rounded it up, it would be just 0.67. Now, when we do the 0.6666667, if you were to say take the distance from Huntington Beach to Catalina Island, which is right here in Southern California, it's approximately 25 miles. So you go 25 by 25 is 625 times 0.67 comes to 418.75 feet of curvature. Well, when I was doing my investigation, I was able to stand on the sand in Huntington Beach, and with a telescope, I could focus in on what is known as Avalon Harbor on Catalina Island. If the curvature that they say is there, and it must be everywhere on it, correlating, corresponding with continuity and consistency, which means that the water must be curving too. There must be at least 418.75 feet of curvature between the sand on Huntington Beach and the edge of Catalina Island, which means that there'd be no way that you could possibly see Avalon Harbor. You can see the top of the island, the top of the mountain, because it's like 2,200 feet tall or something like that. So you could absolutely see the top of it, but you certainly could not see the harbor. It would be impossible. And then one of the other things, in fact, this is the one that really got the wife, because like we were saying earlier, the wife is still actually in the pool industry, and she was still kind of straddling the fence. She has started to notice certain things, but then I told her, I said, babe, just think about this. Think about your own personal life experiences. And she's actually been in the pool industry from the bottom up. She's been a cleaner. She's even done repairs. She's been out with me to do repairs and remodels, and all the way up to management and ownership. And on all pools, and of course, Tios, if you know this, because you got a pool there. When your pool filter starts to get dirty, the filter pressure increases. The only time that you can get pressure is if you've got a physical barrier. And of course, most pools, even when they're clean, they still have a certain amount of pressure within, but yet as that that filter collects dirt, and this is for all filters, it will start reducing the flow and increasing the pressure. Well, like we were talking about earlier, if according to NASA, we just had these gases or the Van Allen radiation belt, which is supposed to be radioactive gas. There's no way, especially with their old model. I hadn't heard about the fluid thing that you were talking about, Shogun. So I'll have to look into that. But like you said, though, the old model was we were in this vacuum. Well, there's no way in the world that a gas could ever create a physical vacuum, short of the dog ripping a fart in the hallway or something, and nobody wants to go down the hallway because the dog made it stink so bad. But outside of that, there's no physical barrier coming from gas. It has to be a physical barrier. So, yeah, that alone, and of course, the so-called barometric pressure is how some of our weather is actually gauged, how we judge certain things. And of course, on that note too, here's something that kind of blows the whole heliocentric model completely out of the water. If the Earth is indeed 94 million miles away from the sun, not only because of the fact that we're allegedly hurling through space at millions of miles an hour or whatever the hell it's supposed to be, wind always takes away temperature. And if we're 94 million miles away, I'm pretty sure that the temperature from that distance is going to pretty much eliminate most of your temperature. But let's just keep it at the distance alone. Just at the distance alone. If you're looking at the difference of distance from the equator, the very leading edge of so-called Earth as a ball, it would be 0.004 from the sun, which means that in terms of temperature, we're talking about a 0.0000 5 zeros and a 27. Essentially, it would be imperceivable temperature differences between the North Pole, the equator, and the South Pole. But yet, as it stands right now, the average temperature of the North Pole is plus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The equator is plus 120 average, and the South Pole is minus 120 average. So just from the equator and the South Pole alone, we've got a temperature difference of 240 degrees. And technically speaking, according to the distance from the sun, there should be practically an imperceivable difference from either one of those 3 points in terms of temperature. In fact, I asked one of my math professors when I was in pre-law about this, and she didn't want to talk to me about it. She just said, "Oh, I see where you're going. No, I don't want to have this conversation with you very much." But yeah, that one's a big one because you can't, again, nothing can be and not be at the same time. You can't have something that's 94 million miles away and heating everything up, but yet it's selectively heating. Come on.
Well,
How can it do that?
We've covered a lot already. If you were guiding someone who's new to this, maybe beginning to question it, where would you say is the 3 main avenues to look at? In other words, right? Where are people going to find proof that they're being lied to about the shape of the Earth?
They got to do it pretty much the way I did it. You got to get out and do some of your own experiments. And like with the wife, you got to take some of your own life experiences and apply them to what you see around you. And in fact, let me cover another one that'll really help people out. Anybody that's ever played with a top, little toys, kid's toy, essentially that's a gyroscope. And gyroscopes have this really strange phenomenon. When they're spinning, it's known as rigidity in space. And when I've had conversations with heliocentrists, they always say, "Oh, it's the magnetic pole, it's the gravity of Earth that the gyroscope actually follows so that the plane actually stays on course." Well, I have a couple of problems with that. Number one, the rigidity in space. Essentially, if you took that top or an actual gyroscope, and they have toys that are more gyroscope-like, to where it's got a little cage around it, and you can get that top spinning and then hold it. That gyroscope does not want to move from where it's at. It will, but you have to feel and you have to force it to do this. Well, it's not so much even that's a big thing for the basic logic. As I did, most of us as kids at some point have played with magnets, flat magnets and ball magnets. Well, flat magnets have a north and a south pole on them. Ball magnets do not. Ball magnets, the actual magnetic pole, and we're talking, it really could be either P-U-L-L, but it's always spelled P-O-L-E. But it's still the same thing. It's that pole. It's the magnetic pole, either a north magnet or south magnet, or on a ball, it's right in the center. Well, no matter how big of a ball magnet you get, and you can find pretty big ones out there, it's still right in the center. And you can take a lot of ball magnets and you can clump them all together. And it's not like north and south or north-north type magnets where they'll reject each other, or south to south. No, ball magnets just all clean together in one big lump, which means that when it comes down to something so simple as the compass, a compass wouldn't work on a ball magnet because the needle would point straight down at your feet. It wouldn't point off to the north. These are just some simple logical things that we can play with on our own. We can go and get these items, these magnets. We can play with them all day long and realize, okay, this is how this one works. This is how this one works. And then my compass says it's like the flat magnets, not like the ball magnet, because you don't have a north and south on any ball magnets. It's really pretty simple. And this kind of really gets into something that I've used this analogy before. This is like if you walk into a room and you see a body with 4 bullet holes in the back of the head, do you need to know the name of the person that pulled the trigger to know that there's been a murder?
Right.
I'll leave it at that.
So, Random Guy, we've covered a lot here, and I feel like we could do a whole additional podcast on this subject. But is there anything else
We've
that
only scratched at it, brother. We've only scratched.
We've only scratched the surface, but I think this is a good introduction for people who aren't too familiar with it. Hopefully, it'll give people who haven't taken it seriously a reason to give it another look. So, first of all, should we see? Is there any questions, comments from the audience?
Sure.
And if not, where would you want to leave in terms of a final message for anybody listening? You know, what would you want them to take away from this presentation?
Well, for those that already are in the on the same page with me and you, it sounds like you're more of a flat earther now. Then this hopefully just solidified a few things and maybe brought light to a couple of things that you hadn't thought about. As far as anybody that is not on board, they're still thinking globe earth or whatever, I would simply say this. Before you say nay to the flat earth, do exactly what I did. Go out with a telescope, some binoculars, a laser, a level. And what I mean by a level, a carpenter's level, where you can actually set it up on a couple of like sawhorses or whatever, and you can adjust it to where you can see what's level. You can have a flat line and such, and see where that investigation takes you. Go out there and do your damnedest to find curvature and movement. And if you can't find either one of those, then ultimately you kind of have to go back to something that one of my favorite so-called quotes, and that is this, and I'll leave it at this. And pursuit of truth can only begin once you start to question and analyze every belief that you have ever held dear. If a certain belief passes a test of evidence, deduction, and logic, it should be kept. If it doesn't, the belief should not only be discarded, but the thinker must also then question why you have been led to believe the erroneous, Socrates.
Excellent stuff. I hope that everybody has given it a listen. Look into some of these sources. Look into the long distance photography records. Look into the mathematics about curvature. Look into the anomalies with the space station. Look into the anomalies with the moon landing. Right. We'll do more podcasts about these subjects.
Oh,
but
yeah. These are whole subjects in themselves because there's so much to cover on each one of those. And of course, the space station and the moon landing could pretty much be done all in one because there's an awful lot of similarities between the two as well.
Well, I saw a question. Go ahead.
What's that, brother?
How does the flat Earth account for volcanoes and mountains?
What do you mean?
Like, what's the explanation of the volcano? And because if the Earth is a globe, then we believe that the core of the planet is molten lava, right? All the things that we believe about the globe. So, what's the explanation for those things? Is it still similar? How does the flat Earth explain volcano?
Well, I look at it this way. This is the thing that I find interesting. Of course, as far as the volcanoes are concerned, the basic heliocentric ball model is that the core of Earth is this big ball of molten lava, and the volcanoes are the lava squirting up out of that center core. Well, the problem with that is mankind, as far as I've ever heard, has only been able to get down about 8 miles. 8 miles. We're not even close to the center. Not even close. And of course, the further down, the cooler it gets. And you get roughly about 6 to 7 feet below ground. In fact, right now in the cellar to the house, it's pretty much 72 degrees under there all year round. All year round. So they don't know. The scientists are just guessing as to whatever the lava is. I have no clue. I'm not a scientist, and I certainly wouldn't begin to presume to think, oh, well, it's this, that, and the other. Because again, I haven't been even 8 feet down below or 8 miles down below the ground. There's some people that have been, but they certainly know that they haven't been to that so-called lava core.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
No worries, brother. And I hope I answered it sufficiently because I'm being honest with you. I don't know what it is, but I certainly know that for a fact because of what I've been told. And of course, according to the military, they have these things called MUDs. And the MUD, I guess, is DUMBs, deep underground military installations.
Bases, DUMBs.
Yeah, they're like 8 miles down. But that's as far as I've led to believe that they can go. So they really don't know what's at the center of the earth, and they're just guessing about these so-called volcanoes as to where the lava is coming from. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you, Random Guy, for the information. I think we could do an ongoing series and dive into topics like deep underground military bases, which we've talked about in the past, but those podcasts, unfortunately, were not recorded. Rest in peace, Philip Schneider. Philip Schneider was a whistleblower about deep underground military bases, and they called him a suicide victim, and they claimed that he strangled himself to death with his own catheter while being in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
So if you believe that, then they killed the guy, and because they killed him, right, you should really think about what he had to say. He talked about these deep underground military bases. We can talk about Antarctica, the firmament, the space station, Mars, etc. But for now, I think
we haven't even gotten very deep into weather and a few other things about our natural surroundings, our environment that are very obvious to us. But because we've been told other things, so many of us, including me, way back when, we believe them. But then when you start to see things for what they really are, you go, oh, I get it now. I get it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. So yeah, well, we should do another one again and cover some of the stuff that we didn't cover tonight, because yeah, we could go for quite a bit, because there is quite a bit. And I just actually made a few notes just to cover roughly about an hour's worth, and we haven't even scratched at those.
Right. And I mean, we can keep going, but I think that
Sure.
these days people have a lower attention span, and it's good to introduce them to things a bit at a time. So if there's anything else that you wanted to make sure you covered, let's do that. And otherwise, let's plan
Actually, the
another
only
episode.
other thing that I could think of right now that would be a really good one, that would be easy for a lot of people to understand, and that is what I refer to as the mixing bowl effect. And what this comes down to is, allegedly, we're on this spinning ball for millions of years, and allegedly the ball is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour roughly at the equator, which means that somewhere around North America-ish, we're spinning somewhere around 750 to 600, and somewhere up around the North Pole and South Pole, allegedly, we're spinning roughly at about 500 miles an hour. That being said, if this was actually true, our weather would be completely consistent across the board. We wouldn't have any high temperatures and low temperatures. We wouldn't have wet areas and dry areas. It'd all be completely the same. And the reason being is, like I said before, the mixing bowl effect. If you take such as a KitchenAid mixer, one of those counter sitting mixers where you just put the bowl in, you put the blade on, you put the cake mix in, you don't even have to touch anything but flip the switch. Within a matter of a few minutes, that cake mix is completely smooth and even. There's no wet spots, there's no dry spots. It's the same consistency across the board. Well, again, if we've been spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, the mixing bowl effect would take place, and it would absolutely be. In fact, things such as trees, buildings, hills, mountains would all act as mixing blades to help this mixing effect take place. But we don't have that. We have high pressure areas, low pressure areas, and the high pressure areas are typically hotter areas. The low pressure areas are typically wetter areas, and so on. Again, this is just normal logical thinking, that you can look at one thing and say, okay, well, this happens here. Why the fuck isn't it happening outside? If we're allegedly spinning at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, why isn't it happening there? And of course, the answer that you always get from the heliocentrist is, it's the math. Well, when it comes to that, I'm not a math genius. In fact, I'm actually dyslexic. But when I was going through pre-law, I did get 2 A's in math, and one of those math classes was statistics. Well, pretty much anything in algebra, trig, and all these other things are formulas. Well, the big thing that you learn in statistics is formulas. So once you know the formula and what the vectors for the formula are, the math part then is just simply doing the calculations. Well, whenever they throw out these math equations for whatever, they're so convoluted, they're not even understandable. It would only be possible if it was an absolute math prodigy genius. And I don't even think that would be possible either, because it doesn't make sense. Like with light bending, like you said, it wouldn't bend up, it would be, or bend away, not down or whatever. Yeah, certain things just, again, can't be. It's either going to be this way or that way, and nothing in between. So we'll leave it at that.
Well, Random Guy, I really thank you for joining us tonight on the podcast, and be sure to see you again. I'm sure we'll do a bunch more podcasts, because you're a man of knowledge of many different subjects, not just the flat earth. So can't wait to listen to another podcast with you, brother.
Absolutely, brother. Truly appreciate it. And good talking to you again. I missed.
And don't take the mark of the beast, right? Follow us on YouTube and BitChute, Temple Mount, right? Be good.
There you go.
Yeah, thanks, Random Guy. That was great. Thanks, man.
Thank you, brother. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, I think it went well. And like we were talking about, we barely